turbo engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
Questions. Research.
technology. Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to the Naked Scientists podcast. This is the programme where we bring you the biggest breakthroughs and talk to the major movers and shakers in the worlds of science, technology and medicine. I'm Chris Smith, and this week, how science is shaping the future of warfare.
From Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, this is The Naked Scientists.
From Gaza to Ukraine, Sudan to Myanmar, war is not something that happens elsewhere. It's present and it shapes economies, borders, families and futures. But modern warfare doesn't just happen with boots on the ground. It's deeply entangled with science and technology, from surveillance satellites and missile guidance to drones, cyber weapons and battlefield algorithms. And in this episode, we're exploring how science is transforming the nature of war and what that means for the people who are living through it. We begin with Ukraine, where a war that started with tanks and artillery has become a testing ground for modern military science. Here, drone footage is analysed by AI, soldiers carry smartphones as often as weapons, and behind each trench line is a network of digital systems shaping what is coming next. Alona Hlivko is a Ukrainian political analyst and defence strategist. For her, war isn't just a story in the news, though. It involves her direct family and her brother in particular.
Yeah, he's been on the front line for exactly 3 years already. He volunteered in March 2022, not probably anticipating that it would last this long, but he's a part of a reconnaissance unit, and that's just about as much that I can share, meaning he's always on the front line or sometimes even too close to action, which always keeps us worried and on our toes, shall I say.
Given your knowledge of how this is all playing out and what you do professionally, what does this actually mean to you? How have you experienced what's happening to your old country and given the family connection with all this?
Well, it's been a very interesting experience because on one hand, acknowledging that there's a full-scale war in your country, that definitely puts you in a state of shock for at least 6 months. And having spoken to some Ukrainian friends, they've gone through a similar process. But also at the same time, I was living in peaceful UK, in London specifically. So I needed to still stay sane, stay on top of my day-to-day job, my bills. So it was very much a dual existence for me, almost like a parallel reality where you need to coexist between work and war back home.
This presumably, though, and I don't mean this in a rude way, but it must have been good for business because this is your business.
That was the upside, yes. And I do fully agree with the statement that every challenge provides an opportunity. And it, of course, takes resilience and soberness, I guess, and a will to take whatever you have to face and turn it into something productive. So it 100% accelerated my career unwillingly because at the time of the invasion, I was just working in a think tank. And then I went on to run it to become a managing director here in Westminster and eventually even launch my own consultancy, focusing on exactly all of the things that the war in Ukraine is producing at the moment in the world, if that's the right way to say, because it is creating a new stage of modern warfare as we speak.
What is dominating that? We hear about drones. They're probably the biggest thing that has really risen to prominence. But what is different about this conflict in Ukraine that has moved warfare on to a new level?
I think the drones and autonomous systems are definitely grabbing the headlines the most because it's a novelty. But what's being talked less about is the multidimensional approach to war these days. So modern warfare now exists in multiple domains. We see the trench warfare with engagement of infantry and artillery and heavy weapons being used as much, if not even more, than the First World War, Second World War level. At the same time, we're seeing a new digital dimension of this war, the development of modern technology, operating drones through artificial intelligence and deployment of that. electronic warfare is spiraling and booming. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge for the Western nations to tackle when it comes to facing adversaries, but also other domains like economic warfare, like geostrategic struggle of trying to form new alliances and building new partnerships at the time of geopolitical fragmentation. Cyberspace is a really big one, and the one where Russia, for example, and China, with their surveillance capabilities, are getting more and more effective every day. So all of those domains exist simultaneously. And when you're fighting this war, you need to sustain all of those fronts at the same time.
We've spoken to a number of military and defence specialists on a range of topics in recent years here on the programme, including about the war in Ukraine. And the one thing that they're saying is that while Western countries are arming Ukraine, they're also quite keen to do so because they're seeing how a lot of these modern generations of weapons and tactics actually play out in a real world circumstance where they wouldn't normally be able to test them like that until it was the real thing for them. So I suppose in that respect they're quite keen to collaborate with Ukraine up to a point because they actually get to test things.
Yes, Ukraine has definitely become a very effective testing ground for modern weapons. And it goes to everything from long-range missiles to tanks and armored vehicles to potentially very soon fighter jets, as more F-16s are coming into Ukraine and being used in Ukrainian skies. But it's also about the drone technology that you've mentioned at the beginning of this conversation and all the modern developments. Whichever Western countries or even companies have access to Ukraine's battlefield, they can create something, deploy it on the battlefield, and get live feedback of what to improve or how it could be improved. But it's also about learning from Ukrainian producers. The key to Ukraine's ingenuity is the lack of resources and the willingness to survive. And that combination creates a very quick and agile innovation cycle of about 2 weeks. So Ukrainians can create their drones in the garage with basic elements and particles, and then they would deploy it to the front line. They would learn the lessons. They would see how Russia is reacting to them, and adjusting that to the electronic warfare signaling and jamming, and basically the ability to destroy the drone and its ability to perform whatever tasks it was created to perform. The companies and the countries are learning very fast the innovation that they need.
Alona Hlivko, founder and CEO of St James's Foreign Policy Group. As Alona was just explaining, modern conflict is very much a game of cat and mouse where combatants try to stay hidden. Stealth warfare, as it's called, is not just a tactical advantage, but it's a field of applied science. It draws on physics, signal processing, materials engineering and mathematics, all designed to outpace the systems built to detect and destroy. To understand how this stealth works, I met Ramsey Farragher, who's the CEO of the Royal Institute of Navigation at Queen's College in Cambridge, and I began by asking him how submarines attempt to avoid detection.
The primary thing they try and do is stay incredibly quiet. So they move very, very slowly, typically just walking pace when they're trying to be quiet underwater. And in the very beginnings of the design of the whole vessel, silence has been carefully considered. So padded floors to try to reduce vibration of people moving around inside the submarine. No big clunky, whirry, bangy stuff on board. And the other trick they try to employ is to hide in other sources of noise. So if it's raining very hard, submarines can hide under the raindrops on the water. And even in certain times of year and certain parts of the world, they can hide behind the sound of plankton mating.
My goodness, what does that sound like?
Lots of loud chittering in the ocean.
How do they know where they are, though? Because when they're underneath the water, they don't have windows. You can't look out and look for landmarks and things. So how does a submarine actually navigate?
Yeah, that is an excellent and very, very expensive question. They have the world's most expensive accelerometers and gyroscopes on board that are monitoring every change in speed and orientation and just accumulating those changes in acceleration and rotation. That's called inertial navigation. And over time, the uncertainty as to where they are increases. And so they still have to get some kind of position fix. So if they're quite confident that they can poke up a periscope, they'll do so with a GPS antenna on the periscope and get a quick GPS fix. And then they might not need to come up again for a whole nother day. They can get by on the gyroscopes and accelerometers. And subs also have favourite particular places where they'll go and take a depth reading. So they'll go to certain features and ping just once and get a depth onto some undersea mountain or similar structure that they know about, and use that to get periodic position fixes as well.
When we want to actually see where things are, we often use radar. I mean, in World War II, it was a game changer, wasn't it? Being able to see through mist and fog and see things that were coming before they even knew you were there. How does radar do what it does?
So radar is a radio signal that gets belted out very, very loudly from a big transmitter with a very particular pattern. And the radar then listens for that pattern to reflect off things and come back to it. And as you said, radar was invented just before World War II, but it's still the predominant way we can detect aircraft at long range today. And so the vast majority of stealth technologies are all about hiding from those pings.
When you want to hide something from radar, though, how effective is that? Is it really possible to hide from radar? And how does that work?
One of them is to coat an aircraft or a ship with radar-absorbent materials, and they're generally slightly advanced versions of iron filings in rubber and paint and things like that. There's various tricks that are employed to absorb the radio signal. And the second trick is to carefully design the shape of the ship or the aircraft such that the radar pulses bounce away from the radar that sent them in the first place. So there's this concept of a corner reflector, which is when you've got anything making an L shape, a 90-degree angle, which on traditional aircraft is exactly what the tail looks like, with the vertical fin and the two horizontal fins. They are perfect corner reflectors. A radar pulse will bounce beautifully back in the exact direction it came from, shining like a fighter jet Christmas tree. And if you look at stealth aircraft, they don't have any of these sorts of right angles as part of their main structure.
Retro reflectors, aren't they? Isn't that how cat's eyes work in the road, to show you the light from whatever angle you're looking? You see the cat's eyes illuminating the road ahead. It's the same thing.
Exactly, and the reflectors on your bicycle. So they're for the visible. They're basically corner reflectors that reflect visible light, and big bits of metal a few feet long will be great for reflecting radar. And there is a third trick, actually, which is quite rare and quite expensive, which is called active suppression. And that's when the aircraft attempts to very quickly capture the radar pulse, make a copy of it, and return the radar pulse out of phase so that it actually tries to knock out the incoming radar pulse.
Wouldn't that make a gap, though? So if you've got an astute radar operator, they'd see that there was this area that's darker than it should be, corresponding to a patch of sky. And so, in fact, you'd be looking for the absence of something that tells you, whoa, there's something trying to hide there.
In terms of the direct radar return, it'll look exactly the same as there being nothing in the way. So the signal just goes out into space, which would be what you'd expect if there's nothing there. But what you're referring to is when we use bistatic or multistatic radars. And that's when you have the pulse being emitted from a different place to where you're receiving from. And then you can start to look for things that have absorbed energy that you expect to come to you. So say you normally expect to see radar pulses bouncing off a large mountain range in some particular area, and then you see this gap in that mountain range return. That could have been a stealth aircraft that absorbed the energy that normally bounces back from you from that mountain range. So all of these sorts of tricks are played both above and below the water, actually.
Warfare has really shifted with the current conflict, for instance, in Ukraine, towards much smaller aircraft. It's not being dominated by huge, great jets and bombers above the skies of Ukraine and Russia. This is being fought by drones. This is really the first time we've seen this in a major way, isn't it?
Yeah, and stealth then is quite different, and sometimes it's not needed at all. So if you can put up thousands of incredibly cheap drones, they don't need to be stealthy at all. They just will completely overpower the defences of whatever you're trying to hit. And because they're very small and often made of plastic or other composite materials, they actually are quite invisible to radar too. So you get a double whammy. So it can be very hard to see a drone on radar, and they're so cheap you could put thousands of them up anyway.
The interesting thing that I've seen emerging more recently, though, is the fact that they're now being flown on fibre optic because of people trying to jam them. So drones appear, people jam the signals that were controlling the drones. Now they're making fibre optic, remote-controlled drones.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's the constant evolution of the weapon and then the countermeasure against that weapon and then the countermeasure. So the original weapon was we've got lots of drones flown by radio using GPS. The countermeasure was fine, we'll put up loads of jamming signals and we'll stop any of those radio signals getting to the drone. Then the countermeasure was, okay, we'll put 15 kilometers of fiber reel on every drone and we'll fly via fiber. It's just shown how complicated and rapidly evolving that particular theatre of war is.
Ramsey Farragher, CEO of the Royal Institute of Navigation and also a Fellow at Queen's College in Cambridge.
The Naked Scientists podcast is produced in association with Spitfire, cost-effective voice, internet and IP engineering services for UK businesses. Find out how Spitfire can empower your company at spitfire.co.uk.
Music in the programme is sponsored by Epidemic Sound, perfect music for audio and video productions.
This is the Naked Scientist podcast with me, Chris Smith, and today we're examining the science that is driving modern warfare. There are battles that we never see at all going on. No tanks, no sirens, no smoke, just clever computer scientists and mathematicians going about their daily business. In the 21st century, conflict often plays out in cyberspace, through data breaches, ransomware attacks, sabotage of infrastructure, and the silent theft of state secrets. Power grids get disrupted, hospitals can be paralysed, and elections manipulated, but it rarely looks like an act of war. Modern espionage has evolved alongside it. Once it was characterised by briefcases in smoke-filled bars, but now it involves malware, quantum encryption, and digital surveillance that can take place from a kitchen table. Kieran Martin founded the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, and he's now based at the University of Oxford.
Cyber is pretty much always and everywhere a secondary or enabling effect. Now, let's say you've got a well-designed power grid that doesn't have a single off button, and it can detect presences. You might have a little bit of disruption, but you couldn't take out the whole thing. There are a couple of interesting examples going back to the pre-full war period in Ukraine. So in 2015 and 2016, in December of both years during the winter, the Russians went for Ukrainian power grids. And it took them, according to some studies, for one of them it took 1.5 years, for the other it took 2.5 years to prepare these attacks because they're enormously technically complicated. And they achieved limited outages of about 7 hours in one case and 2 hours or under in another case, affecting millions of people. So it was pretty inconvenient and pretty scary. But compare that to what a fighter jet can do, what a bomber plane can do, what a missile can do. In Russia, Ukraine, you're seeing a fierce intelligence contest where the Russians will spy on where are Ukrainian civilians hiding, and they find out that they're in Mariupol theatre. They use cyber to work out what's going on in Mariupol, and then they send in the bombers, and the bombers are much more cruelly, devastatingly effective. You see a huge information war. You see digital reconnaissance before the fighter jets go in to power grids and so forth. So you see all sorts of things, but in the words, for example, of the former head of the British Army, General Sir Patrick Sanders, you can't cyber your way up a river. You can't hold ground with cyber. You can't conquer a territory the size of Ukraine with just cyber. But it's an important and very nuanced supporting capability for intelligence, for information, and to enable disruption and military effect.
And you can, of course, also, through propaganda, influence elections, which means you can put the right person in the right job at the right time, which might load the dice.
You can, and I think when we're talking about that sort of issue, it's not just about elections, it's about the whole dynamic of democratic politics in lots of different countries. And in terms of the Russian-Ukraine war, the information and influencing and manipulation of media, of political discourse is enormous. And one of the things you're seeing, for example, at the moment in terms of issues like community relations in Western countries, a lot of whom are divided over, say, the conflict in the Middle East. You're seeing local Facebook groups being infiltrated by malicious content, misleading content, designed to provoke, designed to divide.
And presumably, the rise of AI is making some of these things a lot easier.
Again, it's important to look at the detail. So back at the end of 2023, people were looking ahead to the next year, which was going to be the year of elections, where most of the democratic world, by coincidence, was having national plebiscites, and people were warning about the risks of deep fakes and ruining elections and so forth. And none of that happened because it's very hard, even with a really sophisticated deep fake, to deceive an entire population. People will notice that it's fake, that will be amplified and so forth. What we actually saw instead in the US, a bit in the UK, is what I was just talking about. Quite clever little fakes in local areas. Quite clever bits of targeted agitation, which went below the radar of national media and national discourse. So the counterexample is the Russians did one of the most sophisticated, in a technical sense, deepfakes I've ever seen, where they pretended to have the Ukrainian Deputy National Security Advisor on television saying that Ukraine was responsible for the horrible terrorist attack in Moscow in March 2024. The problem with that, even though it was technically brilliant and the voice sounded right and the speaker looked right and so forth, was that it was completely implausible. Loads of people had seen the original show it was supposed to be, where it didn't happen. The TV company released the original show and it just didn't pass the smell test. There was no way a senior member of the Ukrainian government was going to go on live TV and say that they had been behind this attack when the rest of the government was vociferously denying it. So I think you have to look for those more micro-targeted points. There was an example where turnout in the 2024 Democratic primary in the state of New Hampshire was depressed because there were AI-generated robocalls to Democratic supporters telling them to stay at home. And people, when they were alone and vulnerable, were much more susceptible than when they were with peers, when they were engaging with other people who could tell them that it wasn't true. So it's a risk to watch. But again, the details of how that risk manifests really matter.
Where do you think we are vulnerable in this space then? Where do we need to put our efforts to, A, showing that there's a deterrent effect, and B, tightening up security to make sure that we don't fall victim?
So we have to essentially plan for, every organization, particularly critical ones, have to plan for the loss of a key network. Sure, try and defend against it, but you can't defend against everything. How are you going to cope to an acceptable level if you're hacked? So that's the one big worry, and I think it requires, to use the cliche, a whole of society defensive approach. Deterrence is much harder. People talk a lot about cyber deterrence and we should hit back hard. And the question you've got to ask is, what activity are you proposing? We can potentially, and we wouldn't obviously disclose this if we were doing it, we can hold other countries' critical infrastructure at risk. But it's unlikely that we're going to go around hacking civilian hospitals, that we're going to put innocent people in other countries at risk. So deterrence is actually quite hard in that respect, which is why one of the things, if you want to use the theory, is sort of deterrence by denial, which is making it harder, which goes back to your point about protecting us better.
Kieran Martin, founder of the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. As we've been hearing, science has always shaped war, from the invention of gunpowder, the tank and radar, through to the atomic bomb, a weapon that was born from theoretical physics. But today, new technologies are pushing these boundaries even further. Autonomous drones, artificial intelligence, gene editing and space-based systems are changing what war will look like in the future. So to conclude this episode, here is Joan Johnson-Fries, who's a Professor of National Security Affairs at the US National War College and also author of Space Warfare in the 21st Century, Arming the Heavens.
Technology always outpaces policy and strategy for use. And what worries me as someone who focuses on space is there's too little thought being put into what's the end game? How do you end a space war? What's the off-ramp? And although a lot of these space war games are very highly classified, we do know from summaries given the problem of distance. You don't know what's going on. You don't know if your satellite went out because it was hit by a piece of debris, it malfunctioned, or a hostile act. And so there's a tendency to assume the worst and act on a use it or lose it basis, which means that things escalate very rapidly and into the nuclear zone. Because, of course, space is where all the nuclear warning assets are, and everyone wants to adopt a use it or lose it approach. How do you dial this back? And once the assets are lost, you're getting into some real tricky realms.
But it would be an excellent way to really be disruptive, wouldn't it? Without doing too much damage on the ground, initially at least. If you caused major havoc in space, you can blind your enemies, you can really mess up their economy. You couldn't even take cash out at the bank if we knock out the GPS system.
You knock out the GPS system and bad things are going to happen, not just to the military and not just to the country that was being targeted, but on a pretty widespread basis. And again, I think people don't think enough about the secondary and down the line effects of taking out space technology. And we know from some past tests, even dating back to the 60s, that, you break up a satellite, you create a lot of debris, and that debris doesn't know if it's hitting your satellite or somebody else's. So there are these secondary effects in terms of the space technology that are hard to predict. We learn strategy from looking at what has happened in the past. We don't have anything to look at when it comes to space. We can predict, but we don't really know. So if you get into, let's take out that satellite, let's blind that satellite. You don't have to blow up a satellite to make it dysfunctional. You can blind it, but is that an act of war? And is that an act of war that's going to bring on similar retaliation or escalation?
One of the reasons that we've had wars in the past is because of concerns over biological threats. And I mean, this sounds a little bit yesterday as well compared to things like AI and cyber security and so on. But is that still on the table, or have people learned their lesson about that, thinking, no, we always end up being shot in our own foot, so we just won't go down that path? Or is that still regarded as a realistic threat, biological warfare?
It must be still considered a threat. I think there are individuals and groups who, for them, biological weapons might be the easiest to access, because from the programs, the military programs in the past, do we have an accurate inventory of what was developed, what happened to it? Was it destroyed? We would all be remiss not to consider biological warfare as a threat, not just based on the past, but again, countries are going to want to continue to develop responses to biological threats, which could in themselves propagate new issues. So anytime something becomes a threat, it's very difficult to put it in a box and say that threat has now gone away.
A lot of the things that we've worried about in yesteryear are now regulated. There's a sort of international framework about what people regard as acceptable and not, landmine treaties and so on. What about the new threats, the things we've been discussing, the things that are speculative, but almost certainly are being looked at behind the scenes? Is the law keeping up with all this?
Not at all. For example, in space, there is an entire field of space law, but most space technology is dual use, meaning of value to both military and the civilian populations, and having both an offensive and a defensive potential purpose. It's just a piece of hardware. It inherently doesn't have intent attached to it. It's how it's used and what the policymakers want to do with it. And policymakers don't want regulations on how they might use a technology in conflicts, in warfare, in last-ditch moves in warfare. So a lot of the law is what we call soft law, and that means it is expected to be followed, but there's room for reconsiderations if the situation warrants. Policy and law are the last elements of technology use and development. And I say that as a policy person who spent many, many years looking at space policy and having a lot of military people basically say, if we have it, we want to be able to use it. We don't want restrictions on it.
Joan Johnson-Fries, who's a Professor of National Security Affairs at the US Naval War College and also author of Space Warfare in the 21st Century, Arming the Heavens. War has always evolved with our science. So if the battlefield of 2125 stretches from neural networks through to Martian soil, perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised. Next time, very much down to earth though, we're going to be hunting for dinosaurs. Will Tingle looks at how the latest technology is revolutionising ways of finding and learning from these fascinating fossils. The Naked Scientist comes to you from the University of Cambridge. It's supported by Rolls-Royce. I'm Chris Smith, and from all of us here at the Naked Scientist team, thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.